wherever tax is involved, force is involved. That's the currency of state. And so I think that when I look at something and I say, well, what about local participation? Okay, we don't want to elect Caesar. We don't want to support his wars. Let's just take that off the table.
Sure.
And probably our senators and congressmen are just as complicit in that blood as the president. But local matters, right? So what about my community? What about my neighborhood? What about the needs, the real legitimate needs that are right in front of me that we can collectivize and find solutions to? Isn't that a valuable Christian enterprise? If we look at something like a bond measure for a firehouse or a library, what we're saying in essence is that the majority of people are going to exact by force the means of production for that commodity for the community. And it may very well be a good thing for the community to have a new firehouse or a new library, but I don't feel like I can preserve my Christian principles and exact those means and resources from my neighbor who may not be willing at the point of a gun. What I'm doing in any time that I engage in something that has to do with legislation that includes penalties or taxes is that I'm leveraging the guns of government against my neighbor who may or may not agree with that principle. And up to half of the people that live around me may not be willing to do what I have now required them to do. And the same applies with moral legislation. Like if I'm forcing people to defend marriage, have I really defended marriage? If I'm forcing people to do whatever, like I grant that the state has the power to do those things. I grant that the state has the power to protect its borders, to decide what are legal infractions and what the penalties may be. That's their domain to do. But it's not my domain to do. I've been called to a separate order, and my order dictates that we have a different way of resolving. We have a different way of resolving those problems in my community. And I think it's really a lack of creativity on the church's end that has caused us to resort to statecraft instead of creative ministry to resolve the problems in our communities.
Yeah. So what would you say then, classic kind of example or argument would be, someone's coming in and stealing your stuff. I feel like I know your answer to that, but, pardon the graphic illustration, but like raping your wife or like abusing your children or whatever. You don't believe in violence.
Right.
And you don't participate in the political structures. Like how are you going to handle that? Are you going to call 911? Right. Are you going to, pray for them, throw yourself in front of your wife and kids or whatever? Like how, I know that's kind of an overused hypothetical, but like it's
right.
Kind of
well, that's my first answer is always, how many people do you know whose wives have been raped that way?
Yeah.
I've never even heard of anybody on a personal level that's experienced anything like that. But that doesn't mean it can't exist. When we talk about these kinds of hypotheticals, I think it's appropriate to ask hypotheticals. It's appropriate to ground them within a hypothetical world. Like,
sure.
Okay, let's talk about different cases. There's a fantastic book called Dial 911. I think the subtitle is something like Stories of Nonviolent Christians in a Violent World. It's a fantastic book. Dave Jackson is the author. Dave Jackson was an elder for a time at Reba Place.
Okay.
Dial 911 is a fantastic book because it's an intentional community. People, get this, it was up to 300 people in the 80s living with a common purse, all within 10 blocks of each other.
Interesting.
Super neat story and background. What they were wrestling with is that they came from kind of the liberal Mennonite tradition, or at least when the liberal Mennonite tradition was developing in the 60s and 70s.
Mhm.
And they were interested in a lot of social justice issues, and especially prison reform. And so they felt like, being in a high crime area, if they were to engage the law enforcement community, they were subjecting their enemies to violence, and they didn't feel conscionable about that. But this creates a real dilemma, right? So if a guy breaks into my house tonight, and maybe he hits my wife and he takes a bunch of my stuff and he runs out the door, and I say, hey, we're Christians, we're going to pray for him, we're going to forgive him. But then tomorrow he breaks into my neighbor's house, who may or may not be a Christian, and hurts his wife and takes his stuff. Am I morally responsible
Mhm.
because there's a domain and authority that has jurisdiction over that event that I didn't do my part to witness to? And this is what this community is dealing with in this high crime area in
Mhm.
Evanston, Illinois. And so they wrestle with this, and they're not wrestling with it academically. It's a real life experience that's happening in their communities, and they're trying to decide, they're dealing with it in a lot of different ways. I mean, and in that super kind of fun, like Shane Claiborne kind of creative
Mhm.
application way, like nothing's off the table. Like, maybe we should
Mhm.
learn judo. No,
Yeah.
that's not going to
Yeah.
work. Maybe we should do that. They talked about, what kind of property should they own? Like, are we inviting criminal
Sure.
problems into our
Mhm.
lives by the possessions that we own? Maybe we should restrict our property in order to not have
Yeah.
to engage with law enforcement. So all kinds of really beautiful creative solutions. And I love
Mhm.
seeing God's people. This is where I want us to be. I want us to
Mhm.
be engaging in these issues in real time, where we
Mhm.
have to step out, say, that
Yeah.
doesn't work, and step back and say, let's reassess and let's try something else. I feel like the American church has lost this creative sense of wonder about the teachings of Jesus. Like, what can these things do? Like, instead of looking at it as censure and what we can't do, we've lost the art
Mhm.
of taking Jesus's teachings and saying, what can, like
Yeah.
colors, what can we make in the world around us with these principles of Jesus's
Yeah.
teachings? That kind of childish wonder at Jesus's teachings has been by and large lost.
Yeah.
What they ended up resolving, and they're quick to say this is a particular application of our particular situation, our particular place. But where they landed is they felt like they got to know the people involved with juvenile justice and felt like it was very redemptive. Like,
Okay.
the juvenile detention system was trying to fix people's lives. It was putting people in educational
Mhm.
environments and giving them social workers and trying to reclaim lives out of lives of crime and into something meaningful and useful, at least to the extent where they felt like they could engage with it and participate in it. So if it was a young person who broke into their home, they would call the police. If it was an older criminal, they felt like they were just subjecting that person to more violence by engaging with law enforcement, and they wouldn't call the police. That's just a practical solution that they made up out of their environment and situation. And I find that very Christ honoring way to approach those kinds of questions. The other, like what we've been talking about in our circles a lot over the last year, 2 years, is crimes against children that are
Mhm.
happening in Christian
Yeah.
circles.
I was just gonna
And
go there. Yeah.
I get asked about it quite often, and I think that what I always try to talk about in regards to that is that non-resistance is not non-involvement.
Mhm.
That we should be that it's not non-resistant if it's drawing away. What Jesus is doing in non-resistance is getting involved. He's putting himself in the middle of the problem, and wherever we see proper kingdom ethics happening, it will be God's people getting themselves in the middle of the problem.
Mhm.
And they don't know what the solution is. They don't know
Mhm.
how to fix the problem, but they're not going to walk away. That's the thing that's most important. So I think it's better to talk about, when we discuss the issue of hypotheticals, is let's talk about some real
Mhm.
practical resolutions.
Yeah.
My daughters were on the subway a couple years ago, weren't even baptized yet, just young girls. They were
Mhm.
going down to Boston, and there's a guy that's bothering this young girl. She turned out to be 15 years old. He's touching her, he's bothering her, he's making her very uncomfortable. A train full of people that presumably believe in retributive violence and protective violence and all this stuff. Nobody's doing anything. Everybody's going to read their paper. Everybody's going to pretend like it's a domestic situation. They don't want to get involved.
Yeah.
But my daughters see this situation. My daughters are trained that what it means to be involved in kingdom ethics is to get in the middle. So my daughters see this. They get up from where they're at. They come over. They say, "Hey, come and sit with us." They bring her to sit in the middle of them. Now they're in the middle of it.
Yeah.
This guy's now he's bothered by all three of them. He's continuing to be aggressive. They stop at a train station at the last minute before the doors close. Chloe grabs the girl's hand. They all three run off the train just before he can, and the door shut, and away he goes. These kinds of situations
That's
are
beautiful.
This is what non-resistance is.
Yeah.
It's getting involved. And
Yeah.
I feel like if we in faith and obedience get in the middle of the situations that are difficult, that are the middle of the situations that are the problem, it doesn't guarantee a positive outcome for us. Those girls could have been hurt. If we're not real about that, like, hey, that those two guys got involved in Portland several years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. Some guy was going crazy with a knife and accosting a Muslim girl. 2 guys got involved. Both of them died from knife stabs in the heart. Like, it's not always happy endings, but the Christian response is always to be in the middle, to always be willing to pay the price, to always put myself on the line. And in any of these situations, whether it's an intruder in my home or violence in the streets, the question for the Christian community is, how do we get in the middle? And I think if we stay true to that notion, that's where we'll find grace. That's where we'll find miraculous provision. That's where we'll find God.
When I look into the face of my enemy, I see my